The most dangerous room in the French Revolution. Anyone who gets sent to the guillotine on a regular basis probably knows this already. During the French Revolution, the most dangerous place in France was not always the street. When people picture the French Revolution, they usually jump straight to the Bastille, the guillotine, Robespierre, and crowds roaring themselves hoarse in public squares. It all looks very loud, very dramatic, very male. History, in that version, seems to be driven by the people standing at the front, shouting the hardest. But if you pull the camera back just a little, something strange starts to appear. A lot of the language that changed the political climate of revolutionary France was not first forged in the assembly, and it did not first explode in the streets. It was filtered, polished, tested, and spread in elegant Paris salons by women who held no office, had no vote, and in many cases had no formal political rights at all. Welcome to my channel. This is To the Lighthouse. Today, I want to talk about the great Salon women of revolutionary France, especially Madame Roland. These women did not usually hold power in their own hands. But again and again, they shaped who got near power, which ideas became fashionable, and which personalities were lifted up by the age. To put it bluntly, the men on stage during the French Revolution were busy rewriting history, but the women in the salons were often helping write the script long before the curtain went up. Fatal parlors. Let me start with something that is easy to miss. In 18th century France, influence did not belong only to the court or the parliament or the crowd. Public opinion had not yet fully become the mass media world we recognize today. Newspapers mattered, pamphlets mattered, books mattered, of course. But for an idea to move from the page into elite society, and then from elite society into broader public life, it often had to pass through one crucial relay station. That station was the salon. A salon, put simply, was a high-level social gathering hosted by elite women. But it was never just tea, wit, and polite conversation. Who got invited mattered. Who sat where mattered. Who was allowed to speak mattered. And maybe most importantly, who remained memorable after the evening ended mattered. None of this was written into law. Yet it could decide whether someone became a voice of consequence or just another clever person talking into the void. That is what makes the salon so interesting. Under the old regime, women were excluded from the formal center of politics. They could not vote, could not legislate, could not take the floor in the way men could. And yet that very exclusion pushed many of them into mastering a different kind of power. They became experts in running semi-private, semi-public spaces where influence could be built before it ever appeared in official form. They had no vote, but they could decide who entered the room. They could not cast a motion, but they could help decide who trusted whom before any motion was ever proposed. They could not make law, but they could help determine which ideas sounded reasonable and which ideas sounded insane. History is often like that. The places that look soft, elegant, and socially harmless can turn out to be the most dangerous incubators of all. The French Revolution was not simply chatted into existence over candlelight and porcelain cups, but without those rooms warming the language, sharpening the factions, and circulating the mood, the revolution that came later would not have looked quite the same. When we talk about the Enlightenment today, the names that usually come first are Voltaire, Rousseau, Montesquieu, and Diderot. Voltaire gave Europe works like Letters on England and Candide, and he had that rare talent of sounding playful while quietly sawing through the legs of authority. Montesquieu wrote The Spirit of the Laws and treated political systems almost like machines that could be taken apart, examined, and judged. Diderot oversaw the Encyclopédie, which was not just a reference work but practically a declaration that knowledge could be reorganized and the world reinterpreted. Rousseau was something else entirely. The social contract gave later revolutionaries a language of sovereignty that was morally charged and emotionally explosive, while Julie, or the new Heloise, helped spread a vision of feeling, virtue, and authenticity that hit European culture like a fever. But books do not walk into society on their own. That is the key point. Ideas do not become powerful just because they are written down. They have to be circulated, repeated, interpreted, repackaged, made socially attractive. They need champions. They need networks. They need rooms where people with influence decide that this argument, this writer, this sentence, deserves another life outside the page. And this is exactly where salon hostesses entered the story. In a way, they were part editor, part agent, part venture capitalist. A writer like Diderot needed more than paper and ink. He needed an environment in which he would be taken seriously. The encyclopedia became a symbol of the Enlightenment, not only because its content was powerful, but because it was supported by a wider social ecosystem that made it legible, discussable, prestigious. Take Voltaire. What made him dangerous was not just that he wrote well, it was that his lines were perfect for repetition. A sharp sentence hidden quietly in a book can only do so much damage. But once that sentence enters a salon, once it is picked up by intelligent people and repeated in polished conversation, it changes form. It stops being merely literature and starts becoming fashion. Then common sense. Then atmosphere. And that is what these women were doing. They were not performing official censorship. They were doing something subtler and, in some ways, more powerful. They were deciding what was worthy of the table, what ideas could circulate in respectable company, which authors felt promising, which people looked like the future, and which ones could be quietly edged aside. I have always loved this part of intellectual history because it reminds us that ideas do not spread in a vacuum. Even genius needs a room. Even truth sometimes needs good hosting. The French Revolution did not arrive all at once, like a single dramatic thunderclap. What makes it so unsettling is that, long before the Bastille fell, the atmosphere of French society had already been changing for years. And a good deal of that atmospheric change happened inside salons. The salon of Madame Geoffrin represented a certain orderly Enlightenment world. Artists, scholars, and writers could be received there, introduced there, woven into a respectable framework of knowledge and taste. You start to realize that the Enlightenment was not simply a battle between truth and ignorance. It was also a social war. Whoever controlled the social order of conversation had a much better chance of defining what counted as reason, what counted as civilization, and what counted as good sense. By the time of Madame Necker and Madame de Staël, the stakes had become even higher, because France was no longer just intellectually restless. The state itself was beginning to crack. Fiscal crisis was deepening, the tax system was wildly unequal. Nobles and clergy still enjoyed privileges, while ordinary people bore the pressure. The monarchy looked like an elegant old house that still appeared habitable from the outside, while the beams underneath were already rotting. In that setting, Montesquieu on the separation of powers, Rousseau on popular sovereignty, and Voltaire on despotism and clerical arrogance no longer sounded like clever dinner material. They started to feel like dangerous tools. Madame de Staël is especially fascinating here because she stood at a crossroads of politics, intellect, and social influence. She understood not only ideas, but how influence actually forms between human beings. She knew whose words might become tomorrow's direction, and whose brilliance would vanish by midnight. So before the revolution exploded, it was not that nobody in France could see the problems. Quite the opposite, plenty of people could see them. The real question was whether those problems could be turned into persuasive language. Fiscal collapse needed explanation. Institutional decay needed explanation. The old regime needed to be made morally illegible. That kind of language does not produce itself. It has to be organized, rehearsed, refined, repeated until it sounds inevitable. The salon was one of the rehearsal rooms, and once you notice that, you start seeing revolutionary history differently. It is no longer just about bread prices and state debt, though those things mattered enormously. It is also about tone, legitimacy, persuasion, and social trust. It is about how a society learns to speak differently before it learns to govern differently. If the earlier salon women were helping create the long prelude to revolution, then with Madame Roland we enter something far more direct. The music has ended, the actors are in position. Politics is no longer just warming up, it is now live ammunition. What makes Madame Roland so compelling is that she was not a casual observer drifting toward politics because it happened to be fashionable. She had a real moral and intellectual formation. In her youth, she was deeply drawn to Plutarch and deeply influenced by Rousseau. That combination is already enough to tell you a lot. Plutarch gave her a passion for classical republican virtue, the idea that politics should be grounded in civic morality, sacrifice, honor, and public character. Rousseau gave her something hotter, more intense, more morally absolutist. He offered a vision in which a political community without virtue is only an empty shell, no matter how elegant its institutions may look. That shaped the way she understood revolution. She did not see it merely as a redistribution of power. She saw it as a moral purification. She was not satisfied with asking who would win. She wanted to know who deserved to win. And that question matters, because so many political struggles are not just fights over policy, they are fights over who gets to represent justice itself. Madame Roland's home became an important center of political gathering, especially for those who would later be associated with the Girondins. People met there, sounded each other out, formed impressions, tested loyalties. It was not an official chamber, but it functioned as a kind of political laboratory before the official chamber. Who seemed upright, who seemed too coarse, who looked like the future of the Republic, who carried the smell of dangerous ambition. These judgments rarely took shape for the first time in public. They were often formed quietly, socially, in rooms like hers. This was Madame Roland's real gift. She did not rush to the front screaming slogans. She helped revolutionaries build a political self-image. Part of the reason the Girondins appeared so attractive for a time was not simply that they opposed tyranny. It was that they could be framed as measured, virtuous, elevated, like the true citizens of a republic worthy of the name. That moral glow was not self-generating. People like Madame Roland helped polish it. To say it even more directly, while many men were on stage giving speeches, Madame Roland was often backstage helping build their character profiles. And honestly, that makes her feel almost shockingly modern. We like to imagine political branding as something invented by media consultants, but here it already is, in revolutionary France, dressed in candlelight and moral language. This brings me to what I think is the core point of the whole story. When people hear that women influenced the revolution, it is easy to reduce that to gossip, favor, private whispers, personal relationships. As if their power was merely decorative, or intimate, or secondary, but the real mechanism was much deeper than that. Revolutionary France was institutionally unstable. One faction could be cooperating with another today, and dreaming of sending it to the guillotine tomorrow. In that kind of fluid environment, informal relationships often matter more than formal rules. Who knows whom? Who trusts whom? Who is repeatedly spoken of with admiration in private? Who acquires a reputation for virtue, seriousness, intelligence, or danger? All of that becomes political capital. This is where the Salon mattered so much. It did not simply produce opinions. It produced trust. It produced prestige. It produced political climate. Whether someone was seen as reliable, principled, worthy of hearing, or already tainted by threat, these things were not decided in a single speech. They were built through repeated contact, repeated discussion, repeated acts of social shaping, so the Salon women were not controlling one single lever, they were influencing an entire climate system. They helped certain ideas sound more reasonable. They made certain people appear more credible. They wrapped certain political positions in a higher moral tone. They could not necessarily command legislators how to vote, but they could affect the mental world legislators carried with them before they ever entered the hall, who already felt like a friend, who already felt like an enemy, who seemed to embody the future of the Republic, who looked like its hidden threat. This is where soft power becomes brutally hard. It does not hold the knife itself, but it can shape the hand that eventually does. It also helps explain why literature matters so much in political history. Think of how often fiction taught readers to recognize virtue, corruption, sincerity, hypocrisy. In Britain, Samuel Richardson shaped emotional morality through novels like Pamela and Clarissa. In France, Rousseau transformed feeling into moral seriousness. Later, in the 19th century, Balzac would dissect ambition, vanity, and social climbing with almost surgical cruelty. Stendhal would give us Julien Sorel in The Red and the Black, a man who understands how performance and desire work inside a changing society. I remember the first time I read Stendhal and thought, this man really understands how people rehearse themselves before the world. Madame Roland belongs to that same broad universe of moral theater, except she was not fictional. She was living inside the script. And now we arrive at the sharpest question of all. If these women were so important, Why did history leave them so marginal? The answer is brutal. The French Revolution shouted liberty, equality, fraternity, but the human being hiding inside that universal language was very often still assumed to be male. Women could host salons, shape opinion, cultivate political stars, help construct revolutionary language, emotion, and legitimacy. But the moment politics hardened into formal institutions, they were pushed back outside the door. They could influence voting, but not vote. They could shape the revolution, but not fully possess it. No one exposed this contradiction more directly than Olympe de Gouges. In her Declaration of the Rights of Woman and of the Female Citizen, she practically cornered the revolution with a devastating question. When you say human, do you mean women too? If yes, where are their equal rights? If not, what exactly is universal about your universalism? It is one of those questions so clean and so sharp that it tears through the elegant fabric of political rhetoric in a single movement. And for that, she was sent to the guillotine. History, at times, has a very dark sense of humor. Madame Roland's end carries a similar cruelty. She genuinely believed in the revolution. She believed in virtue. She believed in the Republic as a moral project that could make France nobler. But once revolution accelerates, it does not spare you just because you loved it sincerely. When the Girondins fell from favor, Madame Roland was swept into the purge and sent to the scaffold. What makes that so haunting is not merely that she died. It is that she was exactly the kind of person revolutions claim to need. She was not a cynic. She was not simply opportunistic. She was serious, principled, intellectually committed, morally demanding. She believed the political order could be made better, and yet revolutions have a terrible habit of consuming the very people who believe in them most earnestly. There is something deeply literary about her fate. She was a real person, but she feels uncannily like a character out of a 19th century French novel. Intelligent, sensitive, highly disciplined, almost aesthetically attached to ideals, and yet trapped inside the larger structures of her age. She influenced history, but could not fully sign her own name inside it. She helped generate revolutionary language, only to be devoured by the machinery that language helped set in motion. In that sense, she feels like an early tragic prototype for modern political life. This is one reason I find her so memorable. She sits right at the point where moral beauty and political violence touch each other, and that is never a comfortable place to look for very long. So let us go back to the question we began with. How did the great Salon women shape the intellectual direction of the French Revolution? The answer is not that they secretly issued commands from behind curtains, and not that they mystically controlled all the men around them. The real answer is more subtle and more important. They possessed one of the most underestimated powers in history, the power to help decide which words would be heard, which people would be trusted, and which ideas could travel from private conversation into the shared language of an entire age. The French Revolution absolutely depended on hard conditions like fiscal crisis, unjust taxation, food shortages, and the decay of the old regime. But hard conditions do not automatically become revolution. They must first be interpreted, organized, and given moral meaning. That was part of what these women did. They handled ideas like editors. They arranged personalities like directors. They backed futures like investors. They did not hold the scepter, but they often helped determine whose hand the scepter would eventually reach. And maybe that is one of the most interesting things about history. The person who changes the world is not always the one standing highest on the platform. Sometimes it is the person seated quietly under the lamplight, the one who seems easiest to overlook, and who nonetheless decides who gets to speak. Thanks for watching the video. See you at the next lighthouse.